So we wanted to balance that with a different view, a different approach, that my senator from Connecticut, Senator Chris Murphy, he put forward also a few weeks ago his own vision and the way he sees that the foreign policy of the United States should be, and that how we use diplomacy, how we use foreign aid to make sure that we achieve those goals. And I'm very proud to stand here as a resident of Connecticut for a long, long time, to have Senator Murphy here on stage, and to have the honor to be able to introduce him. You have a very extensive bio of him in the program, but there are some things that you cannot mention about Senator Murphy in a bio. For example, the fact that a few months ago he took it upon himself to actually hike and walk through Connecticut. And what I mean through Connecticut means from one end to the other. Stopping at communities, stopping at coffee shops, stopping at corner stores just to talk to the people of Connecticut and hear directly from them. What is their concern? What are the things that are on their mind on different sides of Connecticut? The other thing is that, you know, during when Trump was giving a speech at the NRA, for example, Senator Murphy was tweeting the names of the victims of gun violence in this nation. So he has a unique style, I think, very innovative. I think it's very effective in getting his message through, and I'm honored and very pleased to introduce you to Senator Chris Murphy, who will be addressing us today.
Well, Mazway, thank you very much for that kind introduction. Mazway, you've been a friend to me and to members of the Connecticut delegation for a very long time, counsel that we draw upon. So I was eager to accept the invitation to come here and talk to you this afternoon, to everyone here that's a part of and affiliated with CSID. You do great work. But it looks like you have a really fantastic program. Some real favorites of mine in terms of providing leadership thought have already presented and will present. So I'm really humbled to be part of your program. I apologize in advance for having a very short time frame here. If you have been paying attention, events have been overwhelming us on a daily basis. Up at the Capitol, we have some briefings on the matters at hand regarding the special prosecutor that I have to get back for in a few moments. So I'll keep my remarks fairly brief and then be happy to invite a few questions from the audience before I have to get back to the Capitol. But let me accept the invitation from Mazway, and instead of focusing primarily on the mistakes that I think the Trump administration has made, try to outline for you a different way of thinking about U.S. engagement in the world. You know, I have been a very vocal critic of this administration's foreign policy, starting from the early days of this administration, where they essentially telegraphed that at the center of their foreign policy was going to be the opening of a war between Christianity and the Muslim world by declaring that everyone of the Muslim faith was a threat to the United States. Now, they didn't say that. Nobody got up at the press podium and spoke those words, but that is what is clearly communicated when in your first days as President of the United States, you make the decision to ban individuals from entering this country based upon their religion. That's what they did. They tried to say they didn't, but every court that has looked at this has come to the same conclusion, that this was a ban on individuals based upon religion and country of origin. But I have been equally disturbed by a slower creeping trend line that has played out in this administration, and that is the transfer of foreign policy to the United States military, the militarization of foreign policy. And this has happened in a number of ways, but you can see it maybe most transparently just through personnel decisions. The National Security Council is staffed by former generals. The Department of State is virtually unstaffed right now with no no deputy secretary of state. There's at least one in the pipeline now, and no assistant secretary of states. The entire plan that Trump asked for with respect to our campaign against ISIS would have traditionally been requested of the Secretary of State, but instead was requested of the Department of Defense. And it speaks to what I believe has to be a progressive alternative to this militarization of foreign policy. So I come of political age during the Iraq War. I'm a state legislator in 2005, growing increasingly distressed about a war that at that point is clear to have been started upon false pretenses, that is making America less safe every single day, that it causes extremists from around the world to congregate inside Iraq, shooting at U.S. soldiers, and growing in strength and number and worldwide reach. And I run for Congress in 2006 as a long-shot candidate, but in part based upon my opposition to the war in Iraq. And so I come to Congress skeptical of U.S. military intervention done wrong abroad. But I also learned pretty quickly about all of the positive ways that the U.S. has and can engage in the world. And in this moment of 2007 and 2008, there's a real question as to whether, in the wake of the Iraq War and an Afghanistan war that was rightly started, but was wrongly fought, in part because of all the resources going to Iraq, there's a question as to whether both the Democratic and the Republican Party are going to still be internationally focused, or whether there is going to be cause to retreat, because at the time, polls are telling you that lots of Americans are rethinking U.S. engagement abroad. And so over the years, I have tried to be a voice for a different method of engagement. And the thesis that I have come to, that I proffered in a piece that I released 3 weeks ago called Rethinking the Battlefield. There's an executive summary that runs only about 15 pages. The longer piece is about 70 or 80 pages. You choose. But my thesis is this. My thesis is that every U.S. president is destined to fail internationally with the current foreign policy toolkit that we give them. So why is it that President Bush and President Obama, pursuing very different philosophies, ended up with a world at the end of their 8 years that seemed more chaotic, not less chaotic? And the reason, to me, is not necessarily strategy, it's resources. So we live in a world in which the threats presented to the United States are largely not conventional military threats, whether it be online terrorist recruiters, global warming, creeping corruption, energy-rich petro-dictators. The real new threats to the United States are frankly not ones that can be confronted with conventional military hardware. And yet, from 2003 until present day, we saw a doubling of U.S. military funding. And while we saw some small increases in development and diplomacy funding, the ratio today is wildly out of balance. There's lots of different ways to express it, but the bottom line is that today we're spending 20 times as much money on the military as we are on diplomacy and development. Put another way, we have more people today working in military grocery stores than we have diplomats in the entirety of the State Department. And so when we confront a vexing problem like Syria, almost all of the solutions that the administration poses are military solutions. Not because there is a military solution to the problem inside Syria, but because we cannot even imagine a non-military solution, because we have no resources with which to put forth that non-kinetic set of influencers. So my proposal that I unveiled 2 weeks ago talks about a $50 billion increase in non-military funding, a doubling of the resources that are available to the State Department and USAID. Now, inside that proposal
are lots of reforms with respect to how those two agencies do business, because they do have to reform as well as grow. But you can't fight Russia if you aren't actually putting money on the table to help with the energy independence needs of their neighbors. You can't have any long-term settlement of accounts inside the Middle East if you aren't dealing with the growing ungovernable spaces that are created by lack of economic development and lack of educational resources for young people. You simply can't protect the United States from climate change or bioterrorism threats if you are spending no preventative money globally in trying to attack the sources. That's not soft power to me, that's hard power. It's a different form of hard power, fighting corruption, trying to spread the opportunity to get educated, pushing back against those that are trying to use energy resources in order to bully and intimidate. But all of that has to be done through State Department and USAID. I don't argue for taking money from the military and putting it into the non-military foreign policy budget. I agree with the concept of peace through strength. But I do think that we are mis-resourced today, and I hope you take a look at the argument that I've made. Lastly, let me just make a comment about the trip that the President is about to make. So let me make one comment in the here and now, and then take some questions on current events. This is obviously a very sensitive trip that the President is undertaking. And let me focus on the trip he's making to Saudi Arabia. I hope that he talks to the Saudis about the way in which we can make this alliance work for both countries for the long term. And that is a very real, very difficult conversation that I hope occurs. And the substance of that conversation has to include the fact that the brand of Islam that the Saudis fund does currently often form the building blocks of the very extremist movements that we are trying to fight. That is a very difficult conversation to have. I know you had Will McCants here earlier today who would probably tell you the same thing. But this is very, very important. And I hope that the President and his people raise it. Second, I think we need to deliver a tough message to them about our willingness as a nation to engage in the growing proxy war between the Saudis and the Iranians. The Saudis are our ally. The Iranians are not. But it is not always in the U.S. interest to help the Saudis fight on every corner of that growing proxy war. And if we do fight with them, it has to come with conditions. The United States has its fingerprints all over a famine inside Yemen that is killing a child under 5 every 10 minutes through causes that are preventable. There are 8 million people inside Yemen today who don't know where their next meal is coming from, who are living on starvation diets. And part of the responsibility lies in the failure of the United States to tell the Saudis to get serious about stopping targeting civilian and humanitarian assets inside that country. We have the ability, with a pending arms sale, to tell the Saudi-led coalition that they have to change their mind in terms of the way in which this war is conducted. I think that is a bipartisan sentiment today in the United States Senate, and I hope it's on the table as well. Ultimately, there's no way for the President to succeed in a trip to the Middle East if he continues to harbor this idea that we are under threat from a religion. But if he raises some of those other issues, he can at least mitigate some of the damage, I think, that's been done to U.S. foreign policy. He's not asking for my advice, but that's my advice. Thank you for having me, and I'll open it up to questions.
We actually have 2 mics, so if you could, one in the front, one in the back.
Thank you, Senator, for being here. My name is Ahmed Badir. I'm with United Voices. Just a comment on what you mentioned about Saudi Arabia. I don't think necessarily that Saudi Arabia's brand of Islam is teaching militant Islam, because their brand of Islam is teaching people to just obey the rulers. I think what Saudi Arabia is doing, their actions of not providing democratic reforms and freedoms and oppressive, not only them, but other Middle Eastern dictatorships, that is what's breeding militancy, violence, and others, rather than the religion itself. So I wish that the administration understands that Islam is not the problem, but the oppressive regimes and our support for oppressive regimes in those regions is the problem. Oftentimes, for example, our government is very critical of Turkey, which is a NATO ally. And NATO, I mean, Turkey is light years ahead when it comes to democracy than all these other regimes that are in the Gulf that don't provide any types of freedoms, but there seems to be a double standard there. Thanks.
Yeah, well, Turkey used to be light years ahead. Turkey's, is maybe years ahead, but maybe not light years ahead any longer. No, I think there are two components to the danger of Wahhabism. One is that it doesn't tend to coexist with democracy well, and second, that it teaches an intolerance for other versions of Islam and for other religions that neatly fits in, unfortunately, to those that want to pervert the religion for violent purposes. So I think there are two components.
My question actually builds on the previous one. What is the long-term grand strategy for the United States with respect to the Middle East? And what I'm getting at specifically is the Faustian bargain that we have struck with authoritarian repressive regimes since World War II up until today, in my reading as an academic, has contributed to the mayhem that we're seeing right now. And the fundamental grievance that many people have around the world, particularly in that part of the world, is the United States, which stands up for a set of values. We don't see those values represented in U.S. foreign policy in the region. So the question boils down to something very simple. When will the United States, when will someone in the U.S. Senate stand up and invest in the peoples of the region instead of their dictatorial regimes? That's the core, I think, of a problem that needs to be addressed. I applaud you for the things that you've been saying and doing with respect to U.S.-Saudi relations, but I'd like to respectively push you at least to think about a longer-term strategy, because thinking that these authoritarian regimes are going to, save us or protect our interests, given the demographic realities that you have a lot of young people with no hope and no opportunity, is going to come back to haunt us. I mean, these are the lessons that we should have learned a long time ago. And so my question is really around that question of political development, which you didn't talk about. You talked about economic development, but we need serious investment and leadership from this country on the question of political governance, political development, and fundamentally the question of democratization. I'd like your thoughts on that.
Well, listen, I think my request would be at the foundation of U.S. policy towards the Middle East is humility, is an understanding of what we can do and what we cannot do in that region. We have been playing a failed great game in the Middle East for a long time, thinking that the United States can pull the strings, largely working with and through totalitarian regimes. I ultimately think that there are places that the United States can appropriately lift up the people of the Middle East, but there are other ways in which I think our help and support is inappropriate, given that we fundamentally do not understand many of the complex realities of life, culture, and politics in that region. So I would argue for an economic and development investment in countries that need us. I think of something like we did in Africa for healthcare. Why not engage in the same kind of campaign for education? Why not create a global education fund that goes and seeks to demonstrably increase the number of young people in the Middle East, at least in those countries that don't have the domestic resources, who have access to good education? I'm not sure that the U.S. is the proper tool for political empowerment. I think we could get that very wrong if we decided the United States was going to come in and try to politically empower a bunch of young people from the Middle East. That maybe to me is where the question of humility would come in. But you are right. I mean, the reason why I'm talking about a major investment in development and diplomacy is because that invests power in individuals and in families and in communities rather than a military focus, which really is simply about giving tools to a ruling elite that end up often being used to repress the very people who are asking for power.
Nasser Saber, Egyptian American entrepreneur.
We're going to take all these questions together.
Yes.
Great. 1, 2, 3.
Okay.
Great.
Chris, I think we have an issue here in America, and I don't think either politician or even fellow American understand Islam. And this is the main issue. The point is not shaking Muslim and tell them, okay, Trump is bad or democracy is good, and they take advantage between Republican democracy and Islam in between. So I think we have big issue. If we really need to fight ISIS, number one, home. We have to understand Islam and we have to be clear. This is number one. Number two, in order for you to fight ISIS, you cannot fight it by bullets only. It's ideology. So we need another ideology to fight ISIS. Thank you.
I can take 2 more, not 3. I've got to actually, I'm sorry, I have to run back.
Abdelmagoud Dardiri, a member of the Egyptian parliament, the short-lived democratically elected parliament in 2012. I would really like to thank you for this paradigm shift of changing from militarization of the foreign policy into diplomacy, into promoting the values, the great values of America. To tell you the truth, I am hurt personally when I see General Sisi welcomed here as what he did in Egypt, the fantastic job. Killing and putting people in jail is not fantastic at all. There was a recent hearing in the Congress about the aid to Egypt. And that hearing was saying that what is happening in Egypt is disastrous on many levels. Really, if we want to fight ISIS, we just need to read it from right to left and stop aiding generals who are oppressing people, who are fanning violence in the Middle East, specifically in Egypt. Thank you.
So the back microphone. Okay, sorry. And if you have a question, that would be
a very quick question. Ishan Thur of the Washington Post. When President Trump gives his highly anticipated speech on Islam in Saudi Arabia this weekend, what would you like to hear him say?
I mean, I don't know that it's relevant. I mean, I can tell you what I would like him to say, but that's not what he's going to say. So I would like him to rescind, his support for a ban on Muslims entering the United States. I would like for him to acknowledge the contributions of millions of Muslim Americans every single day to the economic, cultural, and political fabric of the United States. I would like him to educate Americans on the fact that, while there are differences between Islam and Christianity and Judaism, there are incredible similarities as well. These texts overlap in so many ways that people in this country fundamentally don't understand. So I can tell you what I'd like him to say, but I don't think that those things are on his agenda. I mean, quite frankly, my expectations for this trip are very low, right? I do not want an international crisis, right? I do not want a war to start, right? And so my hope is that he fulfills those low expectations. Thank you very much, everybody. Appreciate it.